Imagine a world where the Dark Ages never truly happened, a world where the Mediterranean remained a Roman lake, where the grand libraries of antiquity never burned, and where the law of the Caesars stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the banks of the Euphrates well into the Middle Ages. For a brief, shining moment in the mid-6th century, this wasn't a fantasy, it was a near certainty. The Emperor Justinian stood on the precipice of doing the impossible, putting the Roman Empire back together. His generals had reclaimed Africa. They had marched into Rome. They were poised to knit the fractured world of the West back to the golden heart of the East. But then the invisible killer arrived. It didn't come with banners or trumpets, but on the backs of fleas carried by grain ships from Egypt. The plague of Justinian was the first recorded pandemic in history, and it was a catastrophe of such scale that it didn't just kill people, it killed a future. But what if those ships had never sailed? What if the microscopic Yersinia pestis bacteria had stayed dormant in the shadows of history? In the year 540, the Roman world was vibrating with a sense of destiny. Justinian the Great was a man obsessed with the past. He saw himself not as a ruler of a Byzantine rump state, but as the rightful heir to Augustus. To him, the Germanic kingdoms that had carved up Italy, Gaul, and Spain were mere squatters on Roman land. He had the vision, and more importantly, he had the sword, Flavius Belisarius. Belisarius was perhaps the greatest tactical mind the empire had ever produced. With a tiny force of elite cataphracts, he had dismantled the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a single season. By 540, he had entered the city of Rome itself, sending the keys of the Eternal City back to Constantinople. The dream of Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire, was nearly complete. Then, in 541, the world turned cold. In our timeline, the plague struck Constantinople with the force of a nuclear strike. At its height, 10,000 people died every single day. The emperor himself fell into a coma, his face erupting in the telltale buboes of the pestilence. While he survived, his empire did not. The tax base evaporated. The seasoned legions, the men who had spent decades mastering the art of the combined arms charge, were buried in mass graves. But let's change the story. Let's imagine a 541 AD where the grain ships arrive in the Golden Horn, and the only thing they carry is wheat. Without the plague, Justinian's empire remains the wealthiest, most populated, and most militarily sophisticated power on earth. In Italy, the Gothic War wouldn't have been the 20-year slog of attrition that turned the peninsula into a graveyard. In our history, the plague crippled the Roman manpower so severely that the Ostrogoths were able to stage a desperate, bloody comeback under their king, Totila. In this alternate 542, Belisarius is reinforced by fresh, healthy legions paid for by a booming economy. The Gothic resistance is crushed within months, not decades. The cities of Italy, Milan, Ravenna, Rome, are spared the repeated sieges that reduced them to ruins. The Roman infrastructure, the aqueducts, and the roads remain intact and operational. With Italy secured and the treasury overflowing, Justinian looks west. The Visigoths in Spain were already in the middle of a civil war. In our world, Justinian could only afford to send a skeleton crew to grab a small slice of the Spanish coast. In this timeline, a full Roman expeditionary force lands in Cartagena. Within a few years, the entire Iberian Peninsula is brought back into the fold. But the most significant change happens in the east. For centuries, Rome's greatest rival was Sassanid Persia. In our timeline, the plague hit both empires, but it left Rome, which was fighting on multiple fronts, far more vulnerable. A weakened Rome meant a weakened border. If Rome had remained at full strength, the massive fortifications along the Euphrates would have been manned by tens of thousands of professional soldiers, not the hollowed-out garrisons of our history. The perennial wars with Persia would likely have ended in a stalemate of giants, a stable Cold War between two superpowers that neither could afford to break. Now, we must look at the long-term ripples. The absence of the plague doesn't just mean more soldiers, it means a different kind of Europe. In the late 6th century of our world, a Germanic tribe called the Lombards descended into a depopulated, plague-ravaged Italy and tore it away from the Romans. This was the moment Italy was truly lost to the Middle Ages, beginning the fragmentation of the peninsula that would last until the 19th century. But in a world without the plague, the Lombards encounter a brick wall. They find a Roman Italy that is fortified, populated, and defended by the world's most advanced military. The Lombards are turned back at the Alps, or perhaps absorbed as peaceful settlers. The Roman lake is restored. From the Nile to the Tiber, from the Ebro to the Bosphorus, there is one law, one currency, and one trade network. This unified Mediterranean would have acted as a massive engine of cultural and scientific preservation. The Dark Ages, often defined by the collapse of trade and the loss of literacy in the West, simply wouldn't have a foothold. But there is an even bigger what-if looming on the horizon: the 7th century. In our history, the sudden and explosive rise of the early Islamic caliphates was made possible because the two great titans, Rome and Persia, had spent a century bleeding each other dry, their populations thinned by recurring waves of plague. When the armies of the Prophet emerged from the desert, they found two exhausted, hollowed-out shells of empires. If Justinian's Rome had remained at its peak, if its cities were full, its coffers deep, and its borders guarded by the legions of a unified Mediterranean, the history of the Middle East and North Africa changes forever. A full-strength Roman Empire might have held the line at the Levant. Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, might have remained Roman for another 500 years. We would be looking at a world where the classical era didn't end with a bang or a whimper, but simply transitioned into a high-tech, centralized Roman Middle Ages. The Renaissance might have happened in the year 900. The Industrial Revolution might have been powered by Roman engineering, fueled by the stability of a 1,000-year peace. Instead, we are left with the ruins. We look at the broken arches of the Roman Forum and the empty pedestals in the Hippodrome of Constantinople and wonder how it all slipped away. We often blame the barbarians or the decadence of the emperors, but the truth is much smaller and much more haunting. The dream of a unified Western civilization wasn't killed by a sword. It was killed by a fever. It was killed by a flea on a rat in the hold of a ship, bringing the world to an end before it could truly begin again. History is a tapestry of grand decisions, but sometimes the most important threads are the ones we can't even see. The plague of Justinian remains the ultimate reminder that even the mightiest empires are merely guests on a planet ruled by forces far older and far deadlier than any emperor. If you enjoyed this journey into the what-ifs of the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. We have many more lost chapters of history to uncover, and your support helps us keep the legacy of these stories alive. Until next time, keep exploring.